Good evening, everyone. My name is Caroline Hafey, and I'm the Assistant Director here at Glucksman Ireland House at NYU. It's my pleasure to welcome you all this evening to launch Elaine Feeney's latest novel, How to Build a Boat. If I could just ask that everyone silence any electronic devices at this time, that would be great. And just to let you know, we will be recording the conversation this evening. So we'll have a conversation for about 30, 40 minutes or so, and Elaine has graciously agreed to read from the novel. And then afterwards, we'll invite you downstairs to continue the conversation with some refreshments and, of course, to buy a copy of the book. So Elaine Feeney is a writer and lectures at the University of Galway. She writes poetry, fiction, drama, and nonfiction. She has published 3 poetry collections, including The Radio Was Gospel and Rise. Her debut novel, As You Were, won the Dalkey Book Festival's Emerging Writer Prize, the Kate O'Brien Prize, the Society of Authors McKittrick Prize, and was shortlisted for Novel of the Year at the Irish Book Awards. It was shortlisted for the Rathbones Folio Prize, and she is widely featured on the Best of 2020 lists. Feeney was chosen by The Observer and The Guardian as a top 10 debut novelist that year. Her short fiction has been published in The Art of the Glimpse, 100 Irish short stories, edited by Sinead Gleeson. Her work has been published widely, including the Paris Review, The Stinging Fly, The Moth, Poetry Review, The Shop, The Irish Times, Poetry Ireland, Oxford Poetry, Copper Nickel, Stonecutter, Lit Hub, BBC Radio, RTE, and The Guardian. No, it's all good. How to Build a Boat, the reason why we're all here this evening. Feeney's second novel was published in 2023. It was nominated for the Booker Prize, shortlisted for Irish Novel of the Year, and named Best Fiction 2023 by The New Yorker, The Globe and Mail, The Irish Times, and it won the Tatler Women's Award for Literature in 2023. Feeney is a graduate of University College Galway, University College Cork, and the University of Limerick. Her creative output is informed by an inquiry into institutions, restorative justice, gender roles, trauma, illness, and empathy in education, nationhood, and working class voices. She's co-founder of the Tuam Oral History Project at the University of Galway, where she is responsible for educational and creative output. The project records, if anyone's not familiar, the archives the first-person narratives of those directly affected by the Tuam Mother and Baby Institution. Feeney was a post-primary teacher in Tuam for many years and was awarded an Outstanding Achievement Award in 2020 by the Association of Secondary Teachers of Ireland. Tonight, she's in conversation with NYU's own Conor Creaney. And without further ado, I'll turn things over to you, Conor. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Caroline. So, Elaine, you're very, very welcome.
Thank you.
So we might start with place and setting. You're from the west of Ireland. Is that an important part of your writing process and your writing identity?
Yeah, so it's been really interesting for me that I've delved into place in the novels, because I started out as a poet for many years, and I really wanted to move away from the aesthetic that was outside my front door and back door. Yeah. I've often spoke about how I associated it with shame, or with just maybe, not to be crass, but not being upwardly mobile in a way. So I didn't want to actually investigate the west of Ireland. I wanted to write poems that were kind of more universal. And when I set about writing As You Were, my first novel, I steeped it really firmly in Ireland, obviously, because I don't live anywhere else, but in Galway in particular. But with How to Build a Boat, I really went into the geography of the place and the sea and the landscape, and really looked to that. So it was very important for me in a way that I felt that nobody was writing about Galway in a realistic sense, or with any sort of whack of realism. And I just wanted to maybe capture that. I mean, it's a really wild and beautiful and bountiful place to write about, so why not? And I know nothing else.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the novel is also set in a school, and I know you were a teacher for many years. And
they'll take this award back off.
And I'm wondering how your own experience as a student, as a teacher, sort of feeds into what you were interested in doing in this novel.
Yeah, It's a very complex question, and in a way, it's a very simple answer. I was a teacher for 20 years, so of course, it feeds into the work.
Yeah.
It would be like ridiculous to say it doesn't, even though the place did become a very fictional place. And the town is a fictional town because it needed to be an industrial town that was sort of brutal, that was also by the sea, which doesn't really exist in Galway. I mean,
Right,
the further east you go, and that's where I live, is more like marts and, kind of, it's a different than around the sea, which is obviously where, real estate is more expensive. People want to live there. And then the further east you come, it's more real life, I suppose. So I had to make this hybrid sort of town because obviously he couldn't launch the boat in the bath. So anyway, but it needed also to have at its centre, I wanted it to have that regional town hierarchy, and it needed at its centre to have one of these oppressive Catholic schools that for various reasons, both going to school and also teaching, that I was very familiar with. I don't know if many people in the room are familiar with the setup, some are nodding. So the patronage of the school system in Ireland is predominantly run by the Catholic Church, which in itself is fine with respect to choice and so on. However, the salaries of the teachers are paid by the state. And when I started teaching 20 years ago, I was very young and very naive, and I didn't understand the complexity that could arise in a situation like this. So, that was important for me to put this oppressive institution into the town and see what sort of effect it had on the people.
And I heard you say in an interview recently that you hated school, yet you became a teacher.
Yeah.
And
no, I hated it.
Yeah.
No, I really, really hated it. So I think that's clear. So, when I started school, 1984. I was 4, and it was run by a nun. The school I started in, and of course, corporal punishment had been abolished in 1979. But it was still, things change legislation-wise, but actually culturally, they didn't change quite so quickly. So it was still, you still get walloped, hit. But what I noted about school from a very, very young age was that there are different stratas in society, and you can be very quickly, you're fitted into them, if that makes sense. And I didn't really understand the why of all of that till I got older, but I really felt it, if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean? And then I went on to secondary school, and I felt it was a very isolating experience for me. And actually, I'm learning something now about the book. I found socializing with other girls quite difficult because I didn't understand the rules around social engagement. I'm quite straight in the way I speak and maybe slightly abrupt. So that, and Jamie in the novel definitely is very similar to that type of character, I think.
Yeah. That's. It seems like that you're sort of exploring that sense of the sort of hidden codes, like someone who doesn't seem to know how to read the hidden codes of the hierarchies and the sort of status games and the kind of little power struggles of school life.
He doesn't.
Yeah.
No. But how refreshing in a way.
Yeah.
Because we're all reading codes and double reading them and triple reading them and going home and having anxiety, wondering, did we read the codes right? And Jamie just needed to be this singular character that enters this structure and causes great disruption in it accidentally. Yeah. And they're sometimes the greatest type of people because they're just quite direct, but they see things quite clearly and they're not afraid to say it. I was very influenced by The Emperor's New Clothes as a kid growing up. Are you familiar with this book? I loved that book as a kid. I know it's become a thing now, but yeah. So he's a bit that kid that shouts out, he has nothing on.
Yeah, very much so. And he has a sort of interesting relationship to language, right? He's very hungry for sort of clarity and precision in language. Like he seems to enact that thing you're talking about, where he's always like, hang on, you're using the wrong word here, or what are you talking about? Clarify what you're doing. And it seems his attraction to maths and the sort of perfect kind of universal, understandable world of mathematics seems to be something you were kind of playing with there, right? In relation to the weirdness of language or the vagueness.
Well, playing with it is actually correct because. So Jamie is obsessed with the Iranian mathematician Mariam Mirzakhani, who was the first woman Fields medalist. And that's a slight obsession of mine. So I
Yeah.
seem to have just like projected
Yeah.
myself onto this poor kid. But, you know, he's not actually a mathematical genius in any way at all. He's interested in lots of things. He's interested in the interconnectedness of lots of things. So his mum died shortly after childbirth, and she was a teenage mum, and he wants to figure out what his mum might be like. So he comes across a clip of Marianne Mirzakhani. He likes her on YouTube, and he wonders, is this what his mother might have been like? Because she also, quite tragically, also lost her life as a young woman with a young child. And so it fits the mother figure for him more so than anything to do with him. He's incredibly precocious. So his point of view isn't always reliable. So for what we know, he might actually know nothing about maths. But just as interested, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just an aside, like he's interested in paintings, he's interested in Francis Bacon, he's interested in his relationship with George Dyer. Jeff is the writer, not Jeff.
Yeah.
He's interested in that kind of masculine relationship that they had with regards to, you know, how he abandoned him. He's interested in colour. So he's interested in loads of things, but what he wants is to recreate the energy of his mother, his dead mother. He wants to recreate her energy, and he thinks that if he does this, he'll feel something. It's not necessarily to feel better, but he'll feel a connection to her. No one talks about her.
Yeah.
So the grief is a big part of the novel.
So no one talking about the mother seems interesting as well, right? This sort of sense, shame is another sort of prevailing theme of the book in certain ways, right?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think they don't talk about the mother through a sense of shame, but I suppose because he has no memory of it, the dad is probably protecting him.
Right.
Rather than bringing her into the conversation, if that makes sense. So thinking, well, he has no memories, but so I'm not going to give him them and make him feel worse about himself. I think the shame is very much felt in the character of Tess, the teacher that comes into the novel to sort of cause disruption.
So was she? Yeah, when you say she comes in to cause disruption, was that something kind of quite self-conscious, or?
Well, so there's the three characters. So Tess and Jamie start off on the very first day, early on in the novel, from two different trajectories, which is based on Mirzakhani's own maths, and that's very boring, so I won't get into it. But it's based on something that around geodesics and a billiards table. But I kind of thought to myself, this is incredible. Think about two people setting off from the town, one from the heights and one from the leafy suburbs on the same day, and they kind of collide, and what that trajectory might look like, two strangers, and how they might have an effect on each other's lives, in the way that strangers often do, in a most sort of strange way, the way we meet people, and they're caught in the strictures of this town. So, yeah. So, I don't know, I'm gone off the question now, sorry.
That's
As
fine.
usual.
That's fine. It's just a starting point. But Tess is a fascinating character. Her sort of vulnerability and the sense that both she and Jamie in different ways don't fit into the sort of social structures, and maybe she also doesn't really understand how to exist in that world in a way that's good for her.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it, in a way that's good for her.
Yeah.
I think her also quite direct approach to the school, and the fact that she feels outside of it and outside the story, and it's a boys' school, so it's an incredibly masculine space. I think that it is good for her that she doesn't fit in.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? In the long run, I mean, it's very difficult when you don't fit into an environment or an institution and you have to work there. Yeah. I've heard. People have told me after my 2 decades. But I think in the long term, it's better for her. Does that, what does it mean to fit in a way?
Yeah,
it just means to be... Well, I suppose it means to have a persona, and a public persona, and I missed that class at school, that you don't bring your whole self to everything. So, oops. But it's too late now.
It's the genie's out of the bottle at this point.
Yeah.
And Tadhg is such an interesting character as well in the sense, I mean, he and Jamie sort of seem to come at the world quite, I don't know, like in different ways, but like forcefully. They both have this sort of interest in mechanics and how the world actually works. But Tadhg is very sort of not non-verbal, but he wouldn't be the chattiest, you know.
Yeah, he's a man that's good with his hands.
He's good with hands.
Yeah. So Tadhg is a woodwork teacher that comes from the Aran Islands and ends up in the school where he kind of takes Jamie under his wing. And together, it's not giving away the plot to say that they build a boat because it's on the front cover.
Yeah.
But spoiler. Yeah. But they actually, so he comes from the islands and he's very interested in the kind of inclusion of the kids on the periphery. And I'm fascinated by people who can see that in an educational setting and that everything doesn't have to be categorized or labeled or for people just to actually get on with each other in a very collegial and powerful way. And actually, you're right, in a non-verbal sense. So they set about the task of building this currach. And Jamie has all the blueprints and wants it to be a very specific structure, and Tadhg feels with his hands and goes with his intuition. So there's a lot of conflict about their different approaches. So for me, I felt that my grandfather was a farmer on the west coast of Ireland, a very small farm, so it was a mixed stock farm, and everything was minded and made and fixed and mended and crafted, and milked cows, and we drank this milk. And again, going back to shame, that was an incredibly shameful thing in the 1990s. It was in the 1950s. And obviously when my grandparents passed away, both my grandfathers had worked with their hands, and generations of my ancestors, I have no doubt. I felt that I hadn't asked them the questions around craft or around the traditions of how they did things. So my grandfather was a thatcher of roofs and stuff, and none of us know how to do that. We all went to university. We all use our heads and not our hands. So the book for me was a sort of in a way, I wanted to honour that idea that people just a generation or two generations before me had actually used their hands, but they had used them to great practical effect. Yeah. The currach was a really, really vitally important boat and design for the survival of the people on the islands on the west coast. So it's dying away. That seemed to. I feel my generation moved so far from my parents' generation. I think we may have taken the biggest leap in some ways progressively with legislation in very positive ways. But in some ways, for me, I felt we had thrown the baby out with the bathwater, in a way.
Yeah. And the boat building seems a little bit metaphorical. I don't know how deliberate that is, but to me, or Jamie's desire to build a perpetual motion machine, right, is the sort of idealistic kind of naive kind of childhood thing, but it's also kind of a metaphor for the artistic work that lives on beyond your own existence, and the thing that retains life.
Yeah, and where does energy come from?
In some ways, right?
And how do we store it? And where does it go when we die?
Yeah.
All this energy, because his mum was his champion swimmer. He only has one clip of her on a phone, and she has great energy in that moment. So he really feels that this kinetic energy of his mother is too great a thing to have just dissolved. So when he creates, he wants to go to school only to create a perpetual motion machine. Yeah. And I've had many students that have come to school for one reason and one reason only, and they like to tell us early and often what that is. And it's fascinating and wonderful. And it is wonderful. And what do we do? But we move them into the stricture of the institution rather than allowing them their creativity. So Tadhg tries to convince him that a perpetual motion machine could be a boat, because the wood is always seasoning and it's always on water, and water is always moving, so it's constantly in motion. And it's the closest thing, theoretically, he'll get to one. And Jamie's horridly offended.
Yeah. He's not
because it's crude to him.
But by the end, again, without being too spoilery, does he sort of, come to some agreement? Or?
It's fascinating to look at a retrospective of your own work, and it changes for me often. So that's interesting. And, there's lots of questions around author intent and so on. I don't necessarily think, there's a lot said that this is quite a hopeful book, and I actually think it's quite a bleak book, actually. I don't necessarily think, to bring him together for this mehel idea, which is the Irish idea of many hands make light work.
Yeah.
it's a lovely concept, but, working with my brothers, they would say my hands weren't quite as fast as their hands, so it didn't, it wasn't really fair. So I don't necessarily think that he wanted to be pushed into this community situation. He's an individualistic type of guy. And sometimes to work alongside people like that is wonderful, maybe for you, Conor, but for somebody else it might be an awful thing. Yeah. I would hate to be doing a project with everybody. That's why I write on my own and I control it. Me in control. And I think writing is an out of control world. I'm trying to control the world, so I don't want too many people in my business.
Yeah, totally.
Just put it out there in case you've any collaborative projects. But I would be desperately concerned if someone was building a boat. They were just sort of hammering stuff here and there. I'd be like, oh my God, Anyway, so I don't necessarily think that he was too enamoured by the process at all. It was very overwhelming for him. But I think a lot of other people got a lot out of it. And I think that was the interesting perspective, actually, is what he had to offer the people around him that they didn't realise. Yeah,
very much so. I suppose in terms of people around you, and sort of, not collaboration exactly, but tradition, right? Do you feel a part of a tradition in any meaningful way?
Yeah, I started out as a poet many, many years ago, but I was a slam poet, which was a very unusual endeavour on the west coast of Ireland to run poetry slams, called the North Beach Nights Poetry Slam, no less, homage to, the beats and so on. So we were an unruly bunch, and we really wanted to preserve the oral tradition of poetry and storytelling. So I grew up in an oral tradition of storytelling, so the stories were passed down orally, and you have to tell a story in my family or you don't get Christmas dinner. My friend from university is here. She can, absolutely. We just talk at each other. So I was very keen to not fall into some sort of an Irish poetry tradition that I felt wasn't representative of my voice as a young woman in the west of Ireland with this agrarian upbringing. And it just didn't fit what I wanted to do. And I felt poetry was a very political space at that time. It was pre-Repeal the Eighth. It was pre-marriage equality. So we were very angsty. So when I started to write, I was terrified of writing fiction. I was fine with writing poetry. That might be telling me something. I might be slightly better at poems. So when I started, I had a real anxiety of influence around fiction. That I was quite brazen with the poems. I don't know what that's about. And that people say that should be in reverse. I don't know. But I feel part of a tradition. I am also fine to be outside of a tradition. I'm fine within the canon, outside the canon. People talk about these questions a lot now. That's not why I write. I write to communicate a story to people so that they get enjoyment and read it, and that they're also warned about institutions and hierarchies and how history is cyclical and how we make this big assumption that we move in a progressive linear line, which is very much part of the book, forward. We just seem to have this sort of genetic makeup that we think that, of course, we're moving progressively along, and what we're doing is we're just circling on ourselves constantly. But I do just want to tell stories as well.
I want to know more about the circling. The regressive side of where we are at the moment.
It would be incredibly remiss of us to say not. Of course. It's feeling very, very gloomy, or else I'm in a particularly gloomy mood, but it feels very, very dark right now. And honestly, and I suppose for the novel, you feel like I can't write. How can I write a novel? How can I write a novel in this world? Like, it feels like such almost sometimes a gross thing to do. What do I have to offer an already out of control world? It just feels like, I don't know. But anyway, I just think with this novel, what I try to do is bring it down to this tiny microcosm of a community. And I think that's the only place we can live in right now. That's where I feel I can just live in the community. I'm not great in it. I send my husband out to do all the community work, which he does. He's really good because he's what we call a blow-in. Does that make sense,
yeah.
everyone? So he can kind of do it and not know all the backstories. I know like 7 generations of everybody's family. And when they say, and they know mine, and the sweat just pours off you. So, but the point, no, but I really do believe in the community and having children, for me, seeing a community, what a community can do, this idea of it takes a village to raise a child. Communities are very powerful from grassroots up, but we sort of destroy ourselves at very early committee levels as well. So that was where the book really, you can do something together. You can actually make something together and create.
And you're involved with the Tume Oral History Project as well. And wondering, I mean, that's such a, intense and powerful, initiative. What do you see your role in that as being? Yeah,
so I taught in Tume when the story around the Tume Mother and Baby Institution broke at the time, which obviously made the news made it quite strongly here in New York. I felt, again, complicit, that I was complicit by my very involvement of being an employee, and the bishop was my patron. So it really got to me with regards to my own moral value and where I stood in something, historically. So I approached 2 lecturers in the history department in the university, because I was part-time teaching in the university at the time, John Cunningham and Sarah Ann Buckley, and I said, I think we should record the first-person narratives. A lot of artists were responding to the stories rightly and had been doing it, and I had been writing a little bit about the dark history of institutions in Ireland, but I felt that there's a lot to be said about appropriation, but then there's a lot to be said about platforming voices. That is a difficult kind of junction. So I thought that it would be very powerful if their first-person oral narratives were recorded and held by the archive of the university, but that it would be done in a way that they had a lot of communication with us, so that it's a very long process to take the oral history of a survivor. And there's a lot of back and forth on it, and it can be redacted and pulled back at any time or put forward. And there is a website. If you go onto the university, there's a website. There's a series of podcasts that Cillian Murphy actually narrated, because he's the patron of the UNESCO project in the university and works with this a little bit. So it was really, really important that the first-person narrative voices were recorded. And then I feel you can make art around this archive in powerful ways, but that if the voices want to be heard, that they should be heard first. And that's not always, easy either, because it's a complicated project, because with regards to people that come in with trauma, language is very unusual. They've never spoken about this story maybe to anybody. So it takes a long time to have any sort of linear narrative around it, But we're working with them now on a creative project, and I have to say, last week we had a day in the university and they were doing some writing that was just based around writing and creativity, nothing to do with their whatever they wanted to write about and stuff. And it's a nice communal space. Wow.
Yeah, and that's super interesting about like finding form for their stories. I wonder, when you think about individual people who've been telling their stories, do you find that they're sort of constrained by expectations of how their story should sound, and then they kind of realize actually there's a new way of telling the story, or how does it work?
That's a great question across the board, actually. I think everybody is constrained by people's perceptions of how their story should sound. I think that goes for everybody. You tell your story and you kind of ask, I often ask people, do you remember that? I'd ask my brothers, do you remember that? So that they can say it back to me, because my memory can't always be trusted and I'm not always the best teller of my own stories. So you find that can be a kind of a common thing, is circling back over it to try to find the essence of the story. So it's wonderful in ways, but it's also a very delicate process as well, and there has to be a lot of care along the way too. But I think it's feeding into policy, and we are also feeding this project into the national curriculum, so it's to be hopefully added to the national curriculum in the next few years. So we've worked on an educational component for it as well. So so I think that
you're getting
progress
back into the schools.
Well, Absolutely,
Yeah.
in the way that I want to be
Yeah.
getting back into it.
Yeah.
Affecting change on the curriculum.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And getting back to Jamie as a character, how does your own experience of motherhood sort of feed into his character, his challenges, his persona?
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah. My son is nearly 17 now, so we'll just leave that one.
Oh yeah. He could be.
It absolutely does. I think it was particularly so around the time that our second son was starting secondary school. So when I was pregnant with him, I'd had a brain clot, and it was very unlikely that I was going to survive the clot, but it was very likely that the baby would survive the pregnancy. So at all his major life moments, I always say to my husband, what would you have done? Because I love hypothetically getting him into trouble, as if he's not in enough trouble all the time without making up scenarios where he has to go, what? So I said, where would you have chosen to send him to school? So we had this conversation around where would you have chosen. And he had gone to a traditional boarding school, my husband, religious, and a place he was deeply unhappy in as well. So we have the school stuff to talk about. That's what bonds us. And he said, no, I don't think so, but I probably wouldn't have put as much thought into it as you've put into the kids' education. And so what I did, I think, in How to Build a Boat was I was, in a weird way, taking myself out of the scenario, sending this boy to school, and everything had to be okay.
Yeah.
Even in the worst of circumstances, there was going to be somebody come in and see him for who he was, value him for who he was, and mind him.
Yeah.
So I suppose it was my own way of maybe setting that right in a way, that I could have been taken out of the scenario.
Yeah.
Which sounds like a very brutal way to put something, but I was interested in that, yeah.
Yeah. And so Tess does form this sort of bond with him. I mean, how did you sort of navigate writing that sort of tentative kind of gently kind of expanding kind of relationship?
The Jamie Tess one.
Yeah.
You see, when I write, they're there. The characters are there. I was in the classroom. The two of them were having conversations. It's a very alive thing for me.
Yeah.
So that wasn't hard.
Yeah.
What's hard about writing a book is actually when they won't do what you want them to do.
Yeah.
I wanted more fireworks. I won't lie, but it just wasn't happening. When a character really starts to come alive, you might agree. They can be quite resistant to what you want them to do, and I think that's when you know they're a character and they're not something that you're manipulating for your own catharsis.
Yeah,
I do that too sometimes. but so she, I wanted her to be nicer to him. Actually, I wanted her to be a little bit more maternal to him, and she frustrated me because she's a woman in a situation. She's frozen, she's in a kind of panic for some time.
Yeah.
She's really in a situation of stasis, she's in a real freeze situation.
Yeah.
Through her own trauma.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. We had John Banville talk to the summer Dublin students last year, and he was basically saying precisely the opposite about character. The way he thinks about characters, oh no, I make them do what I want. They're my little marionettes, and it's he's not he's people say characters are alive for them. It's he's not interested in that at all. Which is
this brings me on to a bigger point in his opinion.
Yeah.
And this is my opinion, and people have lots of opinions.
No, totally,
and actually, the book deals very much with the difference between a fact and an opinion.
Yeah.
And I'm fascinated how people are confusing their opinions for facts in real life. I'm but that's actually your opinion. That's actually not a fact.
Yeah.
And people get very irate when you point that out to them. And that goes back again to the patronage of the school. So you have a school system where a boy at 13 is going from a religion class where it's creationism into an evolution class, which is science, into me teaching poetry and talking about Adrian Rich and all sorts of, wonderful biographical details about her that's totally contradicting what they're doing in the religion class. That's fine if you can filter everybody's different approach.
Yeah.
That's not okay if you're Jamie and you're hanging on everybody's word and you're going from this class and that person's contradicting that person contradicting that person. So myself and Banbo can totally agree to disagree.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Because
Yeah,
we
yeah.
have opinions.
Yeah. Yeah, and,
So they
Yeah,
don't
and
come
they're very-
alive for him, but they do come alive for me.
yeah, and a very different emotional effect when you read the two, his novels and yours. Not right there. They're very different things. So I'm wondering, we were talking about you were doing a little bit of reading.
Yes.
Um,
Sorry, my voice is dry from the air conditioning.
it is,
It's a thing here,
It
air
is a thing here. I
conditioning.
know,
Yeah.
they dry it all out.
So apologies. Okay, so I'm going to read a little piece from when Jamie leaves his house and when Tess also leaves her house. So this is the two people on the same day trajectory. And Mirza Khani often said that she was very interested in the structures you can put on a surface and the properties of any given space. So that's the two billiard balls, Tess and Jamie, heading off for their trajectories. Jamie walked the potholed street out of the heights and onto the asphalt main road with its large neon markers. He walked on along the narrow path as cars whizzed by and over the small hill where he sped up, dangerous blind spot, towards the square, and crossed the first pedestrian crossing at the Odeon with its Art Deco facade on Cinema Lane. Jamie liked to walk this street on the opposite side, as the sun would lift up and shine on the cinema in the mornings. He enjoyed walking in the shade. The rain had stayed in the clouds, but Jamie wished for them to open, to burst, and to feel rain on his face. Though perhaps his gran was right, better not to sit all day in damp clothes for the possibility of inducing early onset arthritis. He passed another set of traffic lights at the square, where kids swung around poles, and some didn't bother to check crossing the road, just darted on without looking. Jamie thought them very careless as he walked by Donohue's sweet shop that was now shut down. And on towards the terrace of the looming cathedral, nearly there. There had been weeks of planning the route, etc., etc., etc. So now Owen's words echoed. Mind the road, look left and right of the crossing, what to say, what not to say, how to conduct yourself, and most importantly of all, how to self-soothe. Finally, if things got bad, how to get to safety and raise an SOS. But Jamie was growing frustrated with his father Owen. He had tired of him in cafes or in restaurants with little room between the tables, and especially how cautious he was with him on train journeys, just because they'd once stopped a train in the middle of nowhere, France, to allow the father and son to alight in the hazy moments after Jamie panicked. Jamie was learning things, and as far as general life went, there were very few people who could regulate themselves in any case. Take, for example, the old couple he passed on his walk to school, laughing hysterically on the footpath. This was unnerving. She was outside in a bedcoat with no socks on. Or the people fumbling at the gates of their houses with too much shopping, not having considered beforehand and planned out the shopping with more care, and how this amount of bags made them perfect sitting ducks for a robber. Or how car drivers blew horns aggressively at each other all morning to attempt to make progress in a traffic jam, where it was unlikely to impossible that any progress would be made, as they'd left the house too late and had only themselves to blame. As for people who crossed the road without looking, they were asking for it. And then Tess. So Tess is heading off. Tess Mahan walked along Emery Woods Road, picking up speed as the cathedral spire came into view. Her jumper was tight under her arms. It was not how she wished to be dressed. She was poor at making decisions now. Paul had distracted her, and she wondered sometimes if it were too much on humans to share such close quarters with each other. The only time she was truly alone these days was in the loo, and even then the sound in the house travelled. She had grown up alone, spending long swathes of time at home when Jennings was out for work or Jennings was in the pub. She was used to herself alone, to the things in her head that occupied her. On this morning, her thoughts were coming fast, her hands inflated like they often did in times of panic. Her body had carved a roadmap for panic, and everything was quick to inflate in great cortisol surges. Even teaching, the place she had once felt most control, was making her edgy. She knew it was time to move. This place was past its sell-by date. And while she specialised in additional needs, It increasingly felt to her that every kid who didn't fit the mould of rote learner was being brushed aside in favour of high grades and worse, religion. The college was everything Tess Mahan despised about education, closest to the church and farthest from God. She passed students, and the sight of them huddled in their groups, some kissing, some laughing around phone screens, some smoking cigarettes, unnerved her, as did those zooming past on motorbikes. She yielded at the traffic lights to cross the road at Donahue's. The shutters were down, and flat thistles sprouted from the pavement. Spiders hung off gossamer, and faded sweet advertisements that had fallen from the windows were trapped behind an ice cream fridge chained up inside the door. The shop was heavily graffitied. Fuck the police. Make the rich pay for the recession. Laura is a lessee. Fuck fear. The world is ours. Cursing is a hobby in the West of Ireland.
Yeah.
So I should have given a warning. I know it's very different here. I use worse
Amazing.
words sometimes.
So I wonder if people have questions.
Well, we'll ask
We
them
have
and
some
find out.
microphones. Here comes a microphone.
Hello.
You could ask me this in the pub.
I know. Well, I could. Thanks for embarrassing me. One of my favourite scenes in the novel is when Tess is walking through town and she comes across her father, and she comes across her father's girlfriend, and they're down on their luck and they're a little bit destitute. And up until that point, we'd been very worried about Tess's day-to-day life, her sort of quotidian concerns, which seem very middle class. And you do this wonderful thing where you pierce the veil and you suddenly see this other side to her, but then she closes the veil up again. And I guess my question is, in doing that, how did it come to you? And did you know you just wanted to sort of glance in and glance out? Because it's very masterful.
Yeah, so that's a great question, actually, because it does pierce the veil. And isn't that the way we live between two worlds, when our opportunities have been very different when we grow up? Then we live in these other worlds, I think. And you're trying... I was reading Annie Ernaux's This Man's Place, and just about her father, who used to think about language in the way that he'd have to speak in a certain way and and I think I can be like that, and I think I brought that to Tess's character in some way as well, So Tess is in this crumbling marriage, and she bolts from the church on Christmas Eve, and she goes up to the centre of the town where her father is drunk, Jennings, and he has been missing for some time. He lives pretty much on the streets. And you're right, his girlfriend is with him, but they're two of the happiest characters in the novel. Now, he's deeply unhappy because of his wife dying early in their marriage. But in that moment, I felt he was quite free. And I felt she was really restrained by the people she was with. So she was with, some of the teachers and the judge and his family. And they were all going for champagne in the hotel on the square on Christmas Eve, where they were going to be served by students who were working too late. So it was just a fascinating crossover of everybody trying to hide the father from the upper echelons of the society she's now keeping, and that she couldn't be herself in that moment. And it's heartbreaking, but actually what it does, I felt, was it does break the veil, but it propels her into action, even though it's a very tiny action that she takes, but it propels her into action because she realizes these people are not for her good either. Neither is Jennings. She's quite alone. She's hugely alone in the world. In that moment, and just the power of the human condition to pull yourself up and keep going, and she was remarkable, I think, in that way, just to go back into her routine. Because he has these lucid moments of recognizing her and not recognizing her. Yeah. But family is complex, right? Yeah. Thank you, Douglas. Yeah, go for it.
Was there any thought by you that maybe Jamie had like Asperger's?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think he would be diagnosed with some type of neurodivergent condition, but it was very important for me in the novel, in the writing of the novel, to not label any of the characters, actually. And it wasn't a get out, it was a long, thought out process. around the idea of having a label and being diagnosed and not having it, and how society should be able to bend and move towards incorporating people's needs without it always being categorized on a day-to-day basis. Because you meet someone in a supermarket, you know, we've lost something around patience, and I actually think we lost it actually even post-pandemic. We seem to be really, really edgy with each other. So, you know, if someone looks exactly like us walking along and we lose our patience with them in a kind of a transactional way on a day-to-day basis, we've sort of lost our radical empathy, I suppose. So I suppose the book is maybe a dive into that idea around maybe empathy and acceptance and understanding difference in a way where it's not actually named. But again, he's a complex character as well, because he's quite singular, and he's also lost his mother, so he's had all that grief. And while his father copes, we don't know what his early life was like either, you know. So, yeah. Yeah. I'd love your opinion on it, though, because it's a big opinion one.
When I visited Ireland with my son-in-law, we went to the Aran Islands.
Oh, yeah.
And what struck me as very interesting, he had never been there. And
Your son-in-law?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And, well, I've never been to the Empire State Building, and I've lived in New York all my life, so that's not really surprising. But your character teaches him to build a boat. He's from the Aran Islands. Let's take that to mean they're a little different in the West, in the Aran Islands, and in central Galway.
So again, going back kind of in conversation with your question, I didn't label the island that Tadhg was from because I've spent time on Inishbofin, Clare Island, the 3 Aran Islands, Donegal, all the west coast, and there is a different type of currach along every with regional variances. So I really had a lot of sleepless nights over the actual structure of the boat, which lots of my readers said that was very boring, those 3 chapters where I built a boat. But anyway, and I like that was the thing that really I worried a lot about, because I wanted to be very respectful to the craft. So I built this hybrid boat between that could actually function, because I got lots of different advice, but also so it's a kind of a hybrid boat of the West Coast boats, if that makes sense. It's not the coracle, the buoyant coracle. No, that looks like the soup bowl. But there's similarities between the way that they're all made. What I find interesting, though, is people from the islands have actually said it's even a dying craft there also, completely, that it's not been passed along. So what I really did was I held it in posterity and I bloated a novel all around it. But your point about not visiting the Empire State Building and me not seeing what was outside the door of where I lived is very common. We don't always see what's in our own environment, and we go visit somewhere and we're bowled over by everything, and we really miss engaging with our own community. Yeah, we don't look up. Yeah, hard to look up in the city. It was kind of really strange, but yeah, we'll forgive you.
Hello, my name is Joseph, and I'm interested to know how the first draft for this book was and how much of the first draft ended up being in the novel.
Actually, none, nearly, almost. It was a total rewrite. Yeah. It kind of went in a wrong direction. I knew Jamie needed to build a boat. That was never a question. Jamie was always there and Tess was there, but he needed to build a boat. But I was coming up with all these ridiculous notions around like dystopian apocalypses. That, like, why did he need to escape? And where would he go? England? No, that wasn't happening. I mean, should be the other way around. So in the end, I realized he just needs to build a boat for the boat's sake. And once that kind of clicked with me, then I wrote it in a rewrite really quickly, but it was fanatical writing at that time. It just took me over completely. which I hope happens again very soon for book 3. But yeah, so, and I could have 40, 50, 60 drafts, but I don't really hold them as actual drafts. They're just, but it's a long, laborious and not very well planned process, unfortunately. Yeah, I want to plan it better, but thank you. Are you writing a book? May the force be with you. Stephen King says the first draft, put it away, take it out, and rewrite it. Done. So I'm going to try to do that next time. Yeah. Hiya. Yes. I did. Did I video it? You're going to have to come to the west coast of Ireland. No. It's very difficult to get people on camera. No, actually, I didn't, but that's a good question. So 2 parts to that. The most inspiring person I spoke to was a woman called Elaine Moynihan. She's from West Cork, and I was doing this panel in lockdown on farming. Don't ask. I don't know how they dragged me out to this farming panel. And I was talking to this other woman farmer from Ballinasloe, and she said, you know who you need to speak to? You need to speak to Elaine Moynihan. She built a curragh, and she's a fascinating story around it. Now, I had the book almost written, but when it was lockdown, so I Zoomed with Elaine, and she built a curragh to remember her friend who had passed away. And I said, my God, I'm building a curragh for the exact same reason in a novel, and we had a really, really, really raw conversation about it. What I really wanted to know, did I get the structure of the boat right? That was really important, so she helped with a lot around that. Although lots of people have asked me, did I build a boat? And I'm like, I wrote a book. I'm a mother. What the jeez. I can only do, a few things at a time. Anyway, but she reassured me, but also having the conversation. So I said, what did it feel like when you took the curragh to the sea for the first time? And she said it just overtook her completely. She'd rowed out, but she stood up and she jumped into the sea, she said. It just totally took her. So she's been fascinating. And actually, I'm working on a stage play of the character of Tadhg with Stephen Ogg, who voices Trevor in Grand Theft Auto. Don't ask how this collaboration has come about, but it has. And Stephen came to Ireland a couple of weeks ago and went to visit Elaine and has been going around making curraghs. And yeah, so we're quite into the tactile boat building again. I will write the script. He can do what he wants with the boats. I'm not making a boat. But thank you for the question. Yeah, so and there's some archival stuff in the National Archive, and there's 1 or 2 really good books on it that I had as well. But in the end, I went with my intuition on it, which is a very dangerous thing.
Your friend didn't have her phone in her pocket, right?
To record it?
Yeah, like when she was in the boat, you said she jumped into the...
Oh, I hope not.
Oh, I thought you said she did.
Oh, no? No.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. I hope she didn't.
Did you ever see the documentary? I guess it was officially a documentary, where there was a man in Dingle that built a curragh, asked a couple of friends, did they want to do this with him? And then he was trying to sort of recreate the pilgrimage of St. Kevin to go to what St. James, the pilgrimage that
St. John's, St. John's in Finland.
No, James in Spain, northern
sorry.
Spain.
Okay.
So one summer they went, they left from Dublin and went as far as France for 6 weeks, and then they did it the second summer to complete it.
Okay.
And a number of them were musicians, but the second year, one of the men was offered a very good job, and had a dilemma, and they said you should take the job. So they invited Glenn Hansard to be the 4th person, and I think you would appreciate it. I mean, just because of the whole concept of it and what they went through actually being in that curragh. I mean, there was a film crew nearby, but they just rowed all the way, you know. I mean, but if you looked up boat
I'll have a
in
look.
Glen Hansard. I'm sure, I just can't think of the name.
I'll have I did not see it. And I suppose, just to be a contrarian, I'm slightly adverse to some of the recreation of pilgrimages because of the importance of what the boats were for people's livelihoods and how we have progressed and how, how grateful in some ways I am for that. But I'm really conscious of them as being not a sort of a tour for 3 months of, that they were just, the hardship of actually using them in reality was something and that's why I really wanted Jamie to have a reason to actually need a boat. But in the end, he was another Glen Hansard. Really.
And at the risk of getting spoilery, the
Again.
the ending. There's the use of wood on the last page or two was really striking. And I don't know if we can talk about this without spoiling the book too much.
Go on.
But
It's out a year.
But it's
It's on you.
But I'm wondering.
I'm only joking.
I wonder. I mean, there's like the epilogue has a very sort of poetic sort of register, and it's sort of, you definitely see the poet come out in you. Was that sort of self-consciously kind of, dream-like, visionary, poetic kind of?
Yeah, it really was because, well, I wanted his mother to come back, but
Yeah.
obviously she didn't.
Yeah.
But it's the voices of all the people that have actually brought Jamie to this part
Yeah.
of his life, whether it's Mirzakhani, whether it was Bacon, whether it was Quentin Tarantino, whether it was Marie Tadhg, all these different people. It's just a kind of a mashup. We all have voices in our head, right? Okay, well, spoiler.
How we do.
Who is your predominant voice? Who is that person in your head? Sometimes mine is a mashup of many, many people. So I suppose I brought it into that space and what they might say to him. The wood. I said, I'm fascinated by making things, and I think writing is a wonderfully rewarding, whatever it is, endeavour or madness. But I just often think about what it might feel like to be a carpenter and make a chair and someone sits on it. I've said this a load of times. If I wasn't a writer, I would love to be a carpenter. Because if I made a chair and someone could sit on it and it didn't break, it was a success. And I wouldn't be so interested in their opinions of it because they could sit on it, so there was an ergonomic factor to it. So I'm so fascinated by what wood can do on a practical level, if that makes sense. And I think with writing, I don't see the same sort of practical application of the book where, So that was the wood obsession. My want to be a carpenter.
Wow, there you go.
And it is,
Yeah.
seriously, that's what I would, love to be. So
Well,
next time I
that's-
come back, it will be with tables and chairs.
Brilliant. Well, that's a lovely note to end on. We'll look forward to your return and your
Guinness
your line of
barrels.
carpentry. Brilliant. Well, thanks so
Thank
much,
you,
Elaine. And I believe there is refreshments downstairs, and also we have books for sale that perhaps Elaine might sign a book or two. So, thank you so much, Elaine.
Thank you. Thank you.